start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on food and mood. And this is our seventh webinar in the webinar series, Diet, Nutrition and Health. My name is Vasudha Jeve. I'm one of the GP registrars. I'm organizing this webinar series. Today, we have got really good topics on emotional eating. Sorry, just go back. So we have got really good topics on, we have got Professor Davenport and Dr. Nicholas talking on emotional eating. And we have got Dr. Majumdar and Dr. Kulkarni talking on eating disorders. Our other two speakers are having trouble actually joining the link, but hopefully that will get sorted soon. So I think I won't take much of your time, and I would like to invite Professor Davenport and Dr. Nicholas to start their talk. Yeah. Just a couple more housekeeping slides for before they start. Just wanted to know that wanted to request you to stay muted and turn off your camera during the webinar and use the chat function to ask any questions. We are going to record today's webinar, and it will be published on YouTube channel, Healthy Brahm YouTube channel, for those who can't attend today. And one more important thing, we would be sending out the survey at the end of the webinar, a feedback survey. It takes a couple of minutes. We'll be really grateful if you can fill the survey for us. Thank you. I would like to invite Professor Davenport and Dr. Nicholas for their talk, and I'll stop my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen now. So hopefully everyone can see that. Is that okay?
Yeah, I can see that.
Someone give me the nod. Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Wendy Nichols. I'm a reader in applied health psychology from the University of Wolverhampton, and together with Professor Tracy Davenport, we've been researching emotional eating for almost 10 years now. So for today's talk, we were trying to think what would be the most useful thing for us to present. And so we're going to look at emotional eating in terms of, firstly, what is it? Then why is it of relevance to nutrition and health? And also then a little bit about how we can help and give some ideas about things you might look for, things you might notice when thinking about emotional eating. So first of all, to set the context, and I was just trying to work out, oh, that's it, need to go back one, sorry about that. Okay, and now to drive now, that's a bit quick practice. Okay, so first of all, to set the context, so if we're looking at traditional weight management, and indeed if we're looking at the World Health Organization guidelines, we're primarily concerned with diet and exercise as a means to manage weight and to lose weight. And this is sort of an energy balance hypothesis. And we know that based on energy balance diets, whilst this can be successful for around 70% of the population and can be maintained in the longer term, we know also that half to 3/4 of people using a kind of energy balance, calorie controlled type of diet will actually regain the lost weight and may actually even gain more weight within 5 years of original weight loss. And if we were to kind of try and dig out why that might be, then we can find some answers if we really look at the psychology that really try and get underneath what's going on with people's eating. So with a traditional kind of nutritional or energy balanced diet, what we often find is that people are less tuned in to their hunger and fullness sensations because they're relying on things like counting calories, or they're relying on apps and things to tell them what and when to eat rather than relying on their own hunger and fullness. And indeed, they may also be having rules such as having to wait until they're really hungry before they eat, which can be problematic in the long term. There's also a sense of deprivation that can set in if there are really, really harsh rules being implied or really rigid rules. And so there's an opportunity then for rebound when they sort of can no longer hold on to those rules any longer. And finally, one of the biggest reasons why diets fail is because of food craving. So if we're looking at the sort of reasons why diets might not work. We've got good psychological evidence there for kind of what we can expect to happen in most people, in terms of explaining why traditional weight management might not work. So our argument really is moving away from what people eat and focusing on that, because most people kind of know what to eat. Instead, if we kind of looking at the psychology of it, then we're interested in the why people eat. And in particular, why do they eat when they're not hungry? So they're non-hunger eating, what's the motivation behind that? And we can look at some of the psychological processes that might underpin non-hunger eating. And the other thing that we might look at from a psychological perspective is how people eat. So for example, we know even when people are eating a meal, if you don't pay attention to that meal, so if you're eating while distracted, whilst looking at the television, for example, then you are more likely to snack later on in the day than people who pay attention to their meals. So how we eat is important, and also the why we eat is important. So we decided to focus on one particular facet of that, which is emotional eating, which is one possible route into non-hunger eating, where people might be using food as a means to kind of self-soothe and to regulate their own emotion. And we know that when people emotionally eat, this can sort of dictate, or if you like, can influence how much they eat and also what they eat. So we thought it would be quite good fun if you could use the chat facility. We would quite like to know what foods you prefer to eat, whether it's sweet foods or savory foods, when you're kind of trying to chill out or relax, or you know, use food for a self-soothing. Because one thing that we would like to emphasize is that actually emotional eating can be very functional, and most people engage in it to some degree. So if you want to use the chat, we'd be really interested to know what food would be your go-to food, and we'll have a look at that in a little while. To hand over to Tracy.
We've got that populated already, Wendy. It's coming flying in. And that's one of the things, is we're often quite aware of our default foods that we might use to regulate emotions. But we're keen to point out that emotional eating isn't something to eradicate. It's not necessarily detrimental. In fact, it can be very functional and adaptive if used in the right way. This is one rather extreme example, but Wentworth Miller, I don't know if you remember him, but he was in Prison Break. And in 2016, he took to Twitter and Facebook because he'd been Twitter trolled for gaining weight. And he explained in the text here that I won't read out, that essentially at the time he was suicidal for a number of reasons, and in looking for relief and comfort from those suicidal thoughts. And the thing that helped him get through each day was food. And in working with some weight management centres and clinical practitioners, we found that food can actually play a really important part in our coping repertoire. It presents a strategy that we can turn to help us manage some unpleasant emotions. It's also associated with some pleasant emotions. But the point being is emotional eating isn't necessarily detrimental. It can in fact be functional. And if you do the next slide. So I'm particularly interested in coping, and emotional eating does present a coping strategy. It can be used as Wentworth Miller was talking about. He said he loved watching Top Chef, and the act of preparing meals was therapeutic. So food and the process of preparing it can be a distraction from whatever it might be that's causing us stress, and particularly if that thing is uncontrollable and we can't do anything about it, it presents a useful distraction if used in the right way. It's also a means of regulating emotions as well, which is what we're largely focused on today. So if we've had a bad day at work, for example, we might be inclined to go and invest in some treat foods, some reward foods, some way of patting ourselves on the back for getting through a difficult day. And this is something that we're conditioned to do from birth, essentially. We've all done it, we've all experienced it. A child might be upset or fall, and we use food to soothe. So soothing foods. So the point is that it's useful potentially as part of a coping repertoire. The problem starts when food is relied on too heavily, or it's used to the exclusion of other strategies that might be more effective. Over to you, Wendy.
I was just reading as well all of the the chat that's coming in. There's a lot of commonalities there: chocolate and crisps and cakes, and but someone has put cucumber down as well. So we have got definite variety of foods flying in that people are eating in response to their emotions.
I often say you don't emotionally eat with cucumber, actually, so that's just blown that.
Yeah, we have used that example in the past, haven't we?
Yeah.
So summarizing that then, so we know that emotional eating is associated with this failure to maintain our weight management goals. But our focus has been then on thinking, okay, so if we know what we know about, we know people are eating in response to these emotions. What are these things that we're calling emotions? It's really easy for us to say emotional eating, but then let's think about the function. Let's think about what this actually looks like. And there are so many different emotions. And I think we catalogued around, was it 90, nearly 90 emotions in 96. One of the studies. Yeah, in one of 96 in one of the studies that we've done. And often for the patients or people who are trying to lose the weight, the emotion might not actually be something that they're noticing, because the eating is done on autopilot in response to the emotion. So noticing the emotion is probably the first thing that we need to be thinking about. And it's probably the first thing we're thinking about here is the unpleasant emotions. And I know it's like being quite common vision of kind of Bridget Jones standing there eating the ice cream out of the tub, eating in response to unpleasant emotions and sadness. And this does seem to be the most obvious one and the one that's usually picked out. And general unpleasant emotions, so that maps onto the scientific literature, because unpleasant emotions have received the most attention in eating related research, and less is known, however, about the discrete emotions that may arise. So we know a lot about depression and sadness, but if we were to unpack that in more detail and look at things like frustration, anger, irritation, and really get down to detail, it's very unclear in terms of the impact that those discrete emotions have on our eating. So also then, not to underestimate the impact of pleasant emotions, which can also influence our eating. And indeed, food is really, really central to a lot of pleasant events and social events. So if you think, most rituals involve food of some kind, so birthday cake, wedding cake. When you meet up with people, it tends to be a social thing. You would go for a meal or coffee and a cake. So we do use food to sort of augment our social occasions and sort of to kind of to make them more pleasant. So whilst individuals might not necessarily be using the food to regulate positive emotion, the positive emotions might still trigger an increased intake of food through associative learning, and people might use food just to augment those positive emotions as well. The other reason that positive and pleasant emotions might have a role is because people may be so involved in whatever they're doing and the pleasant emotions that are arising from that social occasion that they actually aren't paying attention to their food as well and not noticing it as they're eating it. So we're really interested in this association between different emotions and how they might act as a sort of influence on eating behaviour. And we conducted a systematic review looking at the association between emotions and eating behaviour. And we actually did two, and this one was on, the one we're presenting today is on normal and overweight adult population, and there's another one that was on an obese population. So within this review, we included 29 papers, and the people within the papers had a BMI ranging between 19.73, which was actually one from China, so it's still within the normal range, to 28.4. And I'm just going to summarize the key findings from that review for you now. So within the findings, we sort of confirmed our hypothesis that people did eat in response to general pleasant affect, and indeed they tended to eat more in the studies that compared positive and pleasant and unpleasant emotions. People ate more in response to pleasant emotions. So it just underlines our argument there that pleasant emotions are really important too to explore as a determinant of emotional eating. Also, we found that stress and depression and sadness consistently elicited food intake and also elicited poorer choices of food in these normal and overweight population. To pick out one study in particular that is a favourite of mine, if I'm allowed to have favourites, kind of like your children. So MACT did a study that looked at students and looked at the stress that they experienced before taking an exam, and found that when they were really stressed, students, before they took the exam, that they were more likely to have the unpleasant emotions like tension and stress. They were also more likely to eat in response to their emotions, and the motivations to eat for eating in these instances were to distract themselves from that stress and also to try and relax themselves. So they had a clear idea of why they were trying to eat in that situation. Two more findings, just to give you an overview, were that both pleasant and unpleasant emotions are important when looking at the emotions that underpin eating behaviour, but also to keep in mind that emotions can co-occur. So pleasant emotions will be important as a determinant of eating in itself, but the absence of a pleasant emotion that might be able to kind of counteract or sort of buffer the effect of a negative or unpleasant emotion could also be influential. So not to discount the fact that you could have a pleasant emotion which could provide a buffer against an unpleasant emotion, so they can co-occur. So moving on now, thinking about how to help. So hand over to Tracy.
So there's two key strategies that we're going to focus on, really. These are the ones that have been evidenced most prolifically in the literature, and they're ones that we've used in an intervention during COVID that we're going to talk about shortly. The first way of helping, we've talked about how emotional eating isn't necessarily problematic and can be functional. So for a lot of people, it's about increasing an awareness of. Some people emotionally eat and they're not aware of, they're not in tune with the emotional eating and they don't recognize it. So one of the start points is about raising awareness, and a mood and food diary is one way of achieving that, because it helps people to become more attuned to emotions and their emotional experiences, and then to link those emotional experiences with some of their behaviors. And in this particular instance, we're interested in food behaviors, eating foods. So during a food diary, which you can complete for any period of time, but we've been doing it over a period of a week, it's about reporting emotions, felt emotions, emotions that I've experienced. And we don't experience one emotion in isolation. We usually experience a combination of different emotions. So it's learning to pick out the discrete emotions and discriminate between them. Then it's about noting when you experience a food craving following the experience of an emotion. And through keeping a diary, just the process of keeping a diary oftentimes helps to raise an awareness of those associations. So it's a start point for interventions. And what we've found through our research is this quite often triggers a search for strategies to regulate emotions in ways other than using food. So it already starts people, the raising of the awareness already starts the search for alternative strategies. Another strategy that's commonly used is mindful eating. Wendy talked earlier about how we tend to eat, particularly in today's society. Many of us work and eat at the desk. So we consume our lunch whilst we're working, therefore we're distracted. Or if you go to the cinema, how many times have you finished the popcorn that you bought before the film's even started? So mindless eating means we've distracted ourselves whilst we're eating. So mindful eating is very much about two phases, really. Mindful about emotions and those emotional antecedents of eating, but also during the process of eating, it's about being attentive to the tastes, the sensations, the textures, and actually slowing down and learning to re-engage with intuitive eating, how we feel when we're eating, when we're experiencing sensations of fullness, and reconnecting with that, because we are becoming more distracted and less intuitive in the way that we eat. And in fact, we've done work with athletes who are taught and schooled in functional eating. You must eat this many calories, we must eat these food types, which again draws them away from that intuitive eating. Next slide, Wendy. So with a food and mood diary, so the COVID study we did was called Food, Mood and You, actually. So I've already mentioned how what you do is you make a note of emotions that you've experienced, if any, at the point that you recognize a desire to eat or a craving. And then it's about linking what you want to eat, what foods are you drawn to, which is why we asked the question earlier, and we'll come back to that later. And then over a period of time, patterns start to emerge. and they'll naturally start to emerge, and you'll naturally start to pull out what are your trigger emotions for food cravings and what particular types of foods are you craving. And as I've mentioned, that is then the start point to start to search for alternative strategies. Next slide, Wendy. So mindfulness in conjunction with a food and mood diary is oftentimes very helpful, because whilst people might search for strategies, and they'll likely default to strategies that they know to be effective in managing, say for example stress or boredom. Someone mentioned boredom in the chat. In giving somebody an alternative strategy to try, some of them might have tried it, but others may not have tried mindfulness. And again, this is about the process of eating. And if we're going to eat to regulate an emotion, that's fine. But it's then attending to that as a purpose. I'm eating, am I enjoying the foods? If I'm trying to increase a sense of enjoyment or reduce a sense of boredom, is it and attending to those emotions and whether or not that's been addressed as we use the food. So I've talked about eating away from distractions to help us to be more present whilst we consume foods. Eating around a dining table with a no technology rule, that's a hard and fast rule in my house, because technology creeps in everywhere with mobile phones. So again, it's about trying to be fully attentive to the process of consuming foods. Next slide. Thanks, Wendy. So this was during COVID, we did a large international study with some of our international colleagues, and we looked at the emotions that people were experiencing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were interested in how that associated with their eating behaviours, because anecdotally, we know that the bacon shelves in supermarkets were empty and there were certain food types that you just couldn't purchase for love nor money. So we did a large-scale survey where we asked people to identify the emotions that they believed associated with eating. And what we found here was it was largely the unpleasant emotions that were associated with food craving. As Wendy mentioned earlier, these are the ones that have largely been explored. But this isn't to say that pleasant emotions weren't associated with eating as well. It's just that the unpleasant emotions were most strongly associated with consuming or foods or cravings. Next slide, Wendy. So what we did was we asked people across the duration of a 7-day intervention to monitor their emotions, to report emotions that they experienced before their strongest craving. People were assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, they were asked on a daily basis to complete a food and mood diary. That was one condition. And in the second condition, they were asked to complete the food and mood diary plus complete a daily mindfulness practice around their eating. So in condition 1, we were trying to raise awareness. In condition 1, we were trying to it was the awareness raising of emotions and eating. And in condition 2, we were also presenting a strategy to manage emotional eating. And what we found over the 7-day duration is that there was a main effect over time for a reduction in unpleasant emotions associated with craving, but there was no group interaction. In other words, there was no significant difference between the two conditions. So the diary plus mindfulness across the duration of the study didn't have a more significant effect. Next slide, Wendy. This was another aspect we looked at. We looked at various aspects of craving. We're just presenting some of it. So this is the food cravings experienced. And what we saw across the 7 days of the intervention was quite a significant, well, it was a significant reduction in food cravings experienced, particularly in the early stages of the intervention. So what this shows to us is these are highly simple interventions that people find easy to adopt and find that they have very quick benefits in terms of managing cravings. So there was a significant effect over time, significant reductions in craving, but again, no differences by group. So there was no additive benefit for doing the mindfulness as well. And next slide. Thank you. So we like I'm a qualitative researcher. Wendy likes her quantitative and her spreadsheets, but I like the words. So we gathered feedback from participants across at the end of the 7-day intervention. And we found that we had an awful lot of positive feedback. What we found from the feedback that it gave people an impetus, it gave people an awareness. It did indeed raise awareness of emotions and how that associated with eating behaviours. And it was a prompt for people to eat, as we mentioned, more consciously, or as we would describe it, more intuitively. What we also found, though, was that people found the mindful eating a slightly more challenging intervention to master than the food and mood diary alone. And what we take from that is that had we continued the study for a little bit longer, it would have been really interesting to see if the diary plus mindfulness had more longitudinal and beneficial effects longer term. Next slide, Wendy. So the findings, really, the take-home messages were that irrespective of whatever group they were in, the food and mood diary or the food and mood and mindfulness, unpleasant emotions were stronger triggers for food cravings at the beginning of the 7-day intervention, but they decreased over the week. You saw that unpleasant emotions were being reduced. And what this suggests is either the interventions themselves or the very fact of taking part in the study and completing the food and mood diary was a trigger for people to search for strategies to regulate unpleasant emotions in particular, which is a beneficial outcome. Happiness is a trigger for food cravings because it was a trigger for some, did remain the same throughout the duration of the study. And as Wendy talked about, you know, foods, pleasant events associate with the consumption of food, celebratory events, birthdays, weddings, so on and so forth. And that remained fairly stable. But both interventions were equally effective in helping to manage food cravings and helping to reduce unpleasant emotions. And as I've noted, participants found the diary easier to use than mindfulness. We believe that in the diary-only condition, because we hadn't provided a strategy to regulate emotions, it left individuals to search for their own strategies. And we know from a great deal of our own emotion regulation literature that people have a multitude of strategies that we use to regulate emotions. And indeed, you will be aware of your own. Some people use music, conversations, friends, social support, exercise. That's one of my defaults. So it would have prompted people to find a strategy that they'd learned, that was well learned, that they knew to be effective. So the question that I'm posing late really is, which emotions do you believe lead to your own food cravings? What are your trigger emotions for emotional eating? And I've left very little time now for Wendy to conclude, so I'll watch the chat and draw those out.
But I think you know, you've concluded the findings from that study brilliantly. So I suppose it's just the take-home points really, which we would like to emphasize, is that we all emotionally eat to some extent, and it can be very functional, but it can also be detrimental if it's done excessively at the wrong time, or that people aren't aware of it as something that might be contributing to long-term weight gain. In terms of emotional eating, it's important to recognize what the emotion triggers might be, and perhaps explore alternative means of regulating those emotions, or of amplifying the pleasant emotions that might provide a buffer against those. But we know that pleasant and unpleasant emotions can both be a trigger to some extent. And just to emphasize that the interventions that we have found to be successful with food craving in the last study that we outlined just were really, really very simple, very easy, something that someone could do for 10 minutes a day, in that keeping a diary for your emotions, to raise awareness of those, and to bring some mindfulness to your own eating practices. And we know that those things had some positive effects in the reduction of cravings over time, and that the participants found them easy to do. So they have something that people could integrate very easily into their lives. So we hope that's a useful takeaway point. So have we got any?
Yeah, no, we've got some, just to summarize then, the feedback that we've been getting in the chat, which is really quite useful, and it supports what we see in the literature. So when asked the question, what's your default foods? We often get asked, because we're very much focused on emotional eating, we always get asked, what about drink? What about consuming different drinks? We always get asked that question, but we're blinkered on the food. But wine came out as one of the consumption behaviours. So I mentioned that because that is certainly an avenue of inquiry. It's just one that we don't pursue, recreational drugs being another. But in terms of foods consumed, chocolate is far and away the winner. in the racing stakes. So chocolate comes in as the most prevalent food choice that you are saying that you consume, which is followed quite closely by crisps, actually, reasonably closely. And then we've got cake, chips, cookies, Snacker Jacks, bread, and of course we won't forget the cucumber that was mentioned. So again, we're seeing largely there that it's there's the balance of the sweet and savoury, but sweet appears to be running in this particular audit trail of our preferred food choices. Now, when it comes to eating and emotions, we've largely got, but not exclusively, and again, this supports what we're saying in our work, because we've largely got unpleasant emotions: stressed, tired, upset, frustrated. But we've also got, which is the point that we're arguing in our publications, the pleasant emotions, so pleasure, feeling at peace. And we know that we'll emotionally eat around pleasant emotions as well. And another thing is we do something called emotional forecasting. So we know what our day might look like. We think ahead and we think about the different stimuli that we might encounter and the challenges that we might face, and we emotionally forecast. Some people gather food as a resource around anticipated emotions as well. So anticipating an emotional day might be that the food you prepare for that day is slightly different to food that you might prepare if you know you're going to have a relatively easy day. So it's not just about emotional. When we talk about emotional regulation, there's a fabulous emotion researcher called Gross, and much of our emotional regulation is forward thinking. It's in advance. It's about trying to set off offset an emotion before we experience it. And that is the same consideration oftentimes with food. Boredom's come in as well. And actually, we looked at boredom specifically in the COVID study because boredom was quite significant in the context of COVID, with lockdown and the restrictions of opportunities to pursue hobbies and so on and so forth. So I'll hand over for questions, I think, Wendy. Do you?
Sure, yeah, if we have time.
So sorry, Tracy, I didn't get what you said.
I think if anybody has any questions, we'll and if we have time, we'll take
yeah. We can give 5 minutes to the questions before we start the next presentation. Pallab and Meghna are here, so please put any questions if you have got any questions in the chat box.
Yeah, we'd be interested to get your feedback on today, as well as the survey that's been been sent round centrally. We've also got our own little survey with the QR code in the corner of the screen now. It's 5 short questions on a Google form. So if you've got time to do that, Tracy and I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll circulate your survey as well, Wendy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone's asked there's a few questions coming in actually. Yeah, people have asked about alcohol and drinks, and we certainly do. Emotions do influence choices of liquid consumption as well. As I noted earlier, we're very much focused on food behaviours and food consumptions. But somebody was asking, I'm trying to go back up to the question, do you mean that our mind makes us think that eating a particular kind of food will make us happy, not the food itself? I'll start with this, Wendy, and I know you'll have things to add, but research suggests, so neuroimaging suggests that the consumption of foods high in sugar trigger reward centers in the brain. So there does seem to be some neurophysiological response to certain food types that reinforce the consumptions of those foods in producing a more pleasant effect. So there is certainly a stimulus response element to it, because we've been conditioned from birth to associate food and certain food types with pleasant events and pleasant scenarios. So we start to develop this stimulus response association, but additive to that, there does seem to be some physiological effects, some neurophysiological effects of consuming particular food types also, which as technology develops, we've got a better chance of understanding in greater depth. Wendy, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think I was just looking at some of the other questions. One person's commented that they eat healthier food at meal times than at other times, and I think that's something that we often see. It's because the meal times are more planned, and so outside of meal times it becomes more impulsive and unplanned and non-hungry eating. So it tends to be, when we're looking at emotional eating, it tends not to be the meal times that people focus on. Someone's interested in research on children and young people, watch this space, and also look at the research by Peach at Aston University. They've got some really good stuff on children's eating behaviour there. Also interested in the hormonal influence. I can't comment on that to a great extent, other than to say that if people go on diets and they have a prolonged periods of time where they go hungry, that it can influence their hormones to the extent that it have some imbalance there. So it means that their perception of hunger and fullness can become distorted. So hormones can influence your hunger and fullness in that way.
The other thing to note with children is that children are really not in control of what they consume and when, or very rarely. They've got little control over that. You know, as adults, we choose the food types, we purchase the food types, we prepare the food types. Children have less control over that as well. So there's a fair body of literature on parental feeding practices around children's eating patterns and behaviours.
Lots of questions for you both, but we it's just because of the time constraint. Maybe we can come back to the questions at the end,
Sure.
or you can probably put the answers in the chat box, Wendy and Tracy. That will be really good. Thank you. Now, yeah, I would like to invite Pallab and Meghna for the next talk. Really good talk, Wendy and Tracy. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Pallab and Meghna. Hi, thank you for joining us today. So would you like me to put your presentation up, Pallab, or you're okay with it? You need to unmute, yeah. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, I was on mute again,
Yeah,
as usual.
fantastic.
I said I'll have a go at trying to do it myself. Let's see what
okay, okay, yeah. Or I can do it, no problem. Yeah.
Can you see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Now if
can
I
you
go
just make it large?
Because yeah, I have a suspicion that if we go on a slideshow, let me go on a slideshow so that it disappears. Can you still see it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's better.
And does it
Thank
move?
you, Pallab. Yeah.
Yeah, it moves as well. Okay, fantastic. That's all sorted. As far as technology is concerned, with fingers crossed that there's no glitch in between. Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting Masudha to this series of seminars that I believe has been happening for a good few weeks now. My name is Dr. Pallab Majumdar. I'm a child psychiatrist, and I've got my colleague, Dr. Meghna Kulkarni, with me. And we're going to sort of do the second part of the food and mood seminar of today's theme. And we were thinking of sort of doing the second presentation or second talk on food and mood with a little bit of twist. So if we fully introduce ourselves, and especially if Dr. Kulkarni introduces her role, then there will be a bit of a giveaway. So I'd probably hold on for now on that, but we could sort of explain more as we go along. So obviously, as the name suggests, and from the fantastic presentation of the previous presenters, Stacey and Wendy, we got the idea that this presentation is about link between eating habits, eating, and mental illness.
Sorry, Pallab, we are having a bit of trouble in hearing you, a bit of background noise. Is there anything you can do, or if Meghna can talk, then that will be good.
Okay, so I don't
yeah, that's
know
better. Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay, I did nothing. Sorry.
Okay.
I did got better. So, okay. Yeah, that's how sometimes technology works. Maybe I'll speak a bit loudly.
Yeah,
if that works. Because from my side, I'm not hearing any interference. So maybe for the receiving end.
Yeah, this is better. Yeah.
Okay. So if you can't hear me, then we'll invite my colleagues. So we are double act like Wendy and Tracy. So if our original plan is to divide amongst ourselves, and then we can come together to take questions in the end. But if there is technological glitch or sound problems, then one of us can step in. That's not a problem.
Yeah, it's still going on and off. It still has a bit of disturbance.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that like breaking up?
Yeah, a bit of background breaking up actually.
Okay, it's breaking up. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's see how it goes over the next 1 or 2 slides. If it carries on, then probably Meghna can have a try it.
I will take over. Yeah.
That's
yeah.
Okay. Just raise your hand if it's carrying on. Yeah, and I'll stop. So I mean, like I was saying, that this today's talk is about the link between mental health and eating, food and mental health and emotional well-being. So the first presentation was about eating, comfort eating. This one is about similar themes, but with a little bit of twist. So we all have different eating habits and eating styles. What we need to become aware of and spread awareness of, and what can become potentially problematic is the possibility of eating too much, eating too little, or unhealthy eating. So I guess our whole seminar series is focused around those issues and what can be done about it, and what awareness we should raise at the universal care level or other sort of services and agencies, and in the public in general, is the theme of our
sorry to interrupt, Vallabh. The sound
is breaking up still.
Do you mind taking over?
Shall I try taking over?
Yeah, and I'll change the slides for you.
That's fine. Can people hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Shall we move on to the next slide then?
Yeah.
Thank you. So awareness of healthy eating is quite important because, as the series shares, the obesity is an epidemic which is on the rise at the moment. Tracy and Wendy have just talked about the emotional eating, and as somebody was mentioning in the comments section, there is a lot about emotional eating, which is accompanied by the easy access and temptation to frequently consuming high calorie intake, processed food, fast foods. And I believe the food industry is also using strategies, isn't it, to ensure that people are continuing to buy these products by making bulk bags, and just trying to make sure that the consumers are just continuously buying new and newer things. So obviously, I think there is no doubt that the obesity and the high weight gain is on the rise. I think we've got to take into element of the mental health conditions as well, because we work in the psychiatry and we see the link between the mental health conditions and the obesity as well, because a lot of the chronic mental health conditions are associated with significant weight gain, cardiovascular problems, increased mortality. So there is a lot of awareness around the other mental health conditions causing obesity. A lot of the medications have side effects as the obesity. So I think there is no denial that the obesity is on the rise. And I think some of the suggestions from Wendy and Tracy were excellent in terms of being aware about one's mood and the emotions in order to regularize the eating pattern. One thing I would like to add on that aspect is also the importance of regularized eating. I think there is no doubt that the regularized eating pattern will absolutely help people to maintain the weight, because what happens is if you starve, if there is prolonged period of starvation, that will give rise to blood, that will lead to glucose levels dropping in your brain, which would mean that when you try and go back to eating, I think I was reading the comments from somebody earlier about, after losing a stone, then they always have this craving for street food, and it's directly linked with the glucose levels dropping in the brain. So the key to regularized eating and maintaining your health is about it's about regularly eating, making sure that you're having all the 3 meals. Prolonged periods of restriction is only going to make things worse. Can we move on to the next slide, please? But I think there's a but. As you can imagine, we were saying that there's going to be a little bit of twist in our presentation, because I think on one hand, we are exploring this if a really significant effect of obesity on the population, but at the same time, now I feel comfortable disclosing where I work. So I'm the consultant from CAMP's eating disorder team. And we have seen an exponential rise in the referrals in the last 2 years. I mean, I think what has happened for us is we have seen the other end of the spectrum. So in today's presentation, we would like to focus on the flip side of the coin. Too much focus and preoccupation on healthy eating can also be problematic, and it can have long-term impact on the society and the population. Because I think, as the first slide suggested, we work with the CAMP services, which is for the child and adolescent mental health services. So we end up seeing lots of teenagers. And what we have seen is that fear of eating unhealthy or too much can often tip the balance to the other side. And that's what we have seen in the last few years. Shall we move on? Shall we move on to the next slide then? I think it would be helpful for us to just give a very brief overview of what different types of eating disorders are, and I'll try and be very quick with that. So who can get it? Girls and women are 10 times more likely than the boys and men. But however, in the more recent years, we have seen that the incidence and prevalence is increasing. So more and more boys and men are getting eating disorders. I don't know if anybody saw the Andrew Flintoff program about binge purge. I think it was released last year. So he is, for people who don't know, he's a cricketer, and he was bullied significantly for being overweight. And he has, I think in that documentary, he talked about emotional eating and just trying to manage emotions by eating. And then he started using purging as means of weight control. So it's quite an insightful program. So I think what we see is we only get to see the tip of the iceberg in the mental health services. There is lots in the population which doesn't come to surface. People don't end up getting support for the eating disorders. But one thing to be mindful about is that eating disorders do have the highest death rates compared to any other psychiatric conditions. So, it can have very significant impact on the physical and psychological health of people. Shall we move on to the next slide, please? So there are lots of different types, but I think I'll give a very brief overview of 4 important eating disorders. So I'm guessing people have heard about anorexia nervosa. So basically, anorexia is excessive. They have the distorted body image. As you can see in the picture, the other side of the mirror, the girl is very, very thin, but there are structural changes that happen in the brain, and they perceive themselves as very fat and overweight and obese. And then that leads to very significant restriction in the diet. They end up losing a lot of weight, and then they can get, it can have lots of effect on their physical health. Shall we move on to the next slide, please, Palla? Because in that, it just talks about the effect of starvation on the body. So it can affect literally all the body parts. I'm not going to go in all the details, but some of the main concerns for us are around the heart problems, because unfortunately, there have been lots of mortalities, even in teenagers. There have been teenagers who've gone significantly poorly, and when the heart doesn't get the nutrition, it can then lead to lots of problems with the heart. People end up becoming very poorly. People end up going to the cardiac intensive unit, and people have died. I mean, that is the extreme case scenario, but in the the more common ones that we tend to see are about, joints getting poorly. Somebody was mentioning about the hormonal effect in the children and adolescents earlier. So it definitely suppresses the hormonal axis, which means that the periods stop. And periods, it's not just about fertility and having babies, but it is about your bone health. So over the period of time, their bones become brittle. People can have lots of significant problems with the fractures of their vertebrae and getting poorly. The other effects that people can have are about their kidneys. I mean, I can go on for a half an hour just on the effects of, but I think what I'm trying to say here is they can have very significant effects on the physical and psychological state. Yeah. Shall we move on to the next stage? Okay, I think I've just seen a question very quickly. So I always thought anorexia was just for short. What is the difference? Yeah, that's a good question. Anorexia per se, it's lack of appetite. So anorexia per se, I think it's a Greek origin. But it can be because, people can have low appetite if they've got fever or, any other medical condition. So anorexia nervosa is the full term that identifies that they are not eating because they have this morbid fear of becoming obese. Then
I can keep an eye on the comments, Magna, if you want, and you can sort of bring those comments back if you want to flow with the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can keep an eye on.
All right. So in terms of bulimia, sorry, I've just seen one question, so I'm going to comment about it at this stage, and I think it makes sense to talk about it here. It's about under eating and excessive exercise in children and teenagers. I mean, we have seen an exponential rise, and it does come later in the part of presentation, but there's excessive focus on exercise at the moment, and teenagers are not always able to fuel that activity. And then I don't know if people have heard about the word called as REDS, Radical Energy Deficiency Syndrome. Where it's a triad. They don't necessarily deliberately want to lose the weight, but what happens is they don't fuel the activity, which means that they have amenorrhea, they have lots of bone problems like fractures, and then they are more prone to develop the injuries, and it can have a very significant impact on their sports career going forward. And then the other bit is they are feeling tired and lots of vitamin deficiencies. So that is becoming more and more common at the moment. So, sorry, moving back to the presentation, then the next type of the eating disorder that people may have heard about is bulimia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa is the eating disorder where there are shape and weight concerns. And what the sufferer does is that they would just end up restricting throughout the day, but then there comes a point when the blood glucose drop, and then they end up eating lots and lots of large amounts of food. So lots of fast foods and crisps and cakes and everything in one go, which then leads to them feeling quite guilty, quite embarrassed. And then they use purging methods. I mean, either they make themselves sick, or they can take laxatives, or, other means of getting rid of the food. And again, if we move on to the next slide, Pallab, thank you. Again, bulimia can have extremely significant impact on the body, because I have seen people getting very poorly. There are leads to certain chemical changes. There's a chemical called as potassium. Those levels go down, which means that it can have a very negative effect on the way their heart beats, and it can make people very poorly. I mean, we had one girl about 2 years ago. She used to purge herself, and sometimes people have to purge lots and lots of times. So she would use sharp objects. So she ended up using pencil to induce vomiting, and then that kind of ruptured the food pipe, which meant the food, then there was leak, and then she developed very, very serious complications linking with inflammation of their inner body and heart. So I think this is, again, it's very silent disorder. As I said, Andy Flintoff had that. And if you look around, I think there are many people who are not always getting help for it. Yeah, shall we move on to the next one, please? So again, I think I won't go into all of the details, but again, using laxatives regularly, you may have persistent stomach pain, swollen fingers. You may find that you can't go to the toilet. You can have constipation, and then there are other electrolyte changes that can happen. It can lead to mood swings. So again, I think laxative use more regularly can be really harmful to your body. Yeah, shall we move on to the next one, please? RFID. I don't know have people heard about RFID at all? Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So basically, there are 3 causes for the RFID. It's a relatively new concept. Not many people have heard about it, but there is an increased recognition that there are certain other group of people who are not necessarily trying to actively lose weight, but they can they end up not being able to fuel their activities. And there are 3 different domains. So one domain is about, sometimes people are worried about, there is vomit phobia, they're worried about being sick, and then as a result they wouldn't eat. So that is one aspect of it. Then there is another aspect where some people are very sensory sensitive. So textures matter, this particular smell, particular fragrance. So there are lots of things that the sensory sensitivities can affect them being able to comply with the meals, which might mean that they're not able to tolerate lots of different variety in the diet. So again, I think a couple of years ago, there was a boy who was diagnosed with RFID, and they would typically eat beige food. We call it beige food, pasta, bread, and the texture is plain, simple. There aren't any very specific tastes. But then what they lack on is having the vegetables, having fruits, having adequate vitamins. So he ended up having vitamin A deficiency, very significant, to the point that he lost his eyesight. So again, I think that's something one needs to be really mindful about, particularly with the families and children. It's not just eating enough quantity, it is about the range of the food and the variety in the diet as well that is important. Shall we move on to the next slide, please? Binge eating disorder, I think I would kind of link it with the emotional eating. It's similar when recurring episodes of eating more food within a short span of time than most people would eat. And then they have this sense of lack of control. They just are not able to stop it. This then leads to disgust, guilt, embarrassment, but then that over the period of time contributes to a lot of weight gain. And then again, it then ties in with the self-esteem and everything. So again, binge eating disorder is becoming more and more prevalent. Unfortunately, at the moment, NHS, at least in Nottingham, we work in Nottingham, at least in Nottingham, there isn't any service that would offer any support for binge eating disorder. So as CAM's eating disorder team, we are not commissioned to offer support for binge eating disorder. But then again, that's a gap in the service. We are seeing that, there is a significant proportion of people who are struggling without any help. Shall we move on to the next slide, please? So what causes eating disorders? Again, I think I'm aware about the limited time. There are lots of possible causes. There is question around genetics and familial, and people are doing more studies which are indicative that there could be genetic factors associated. There are 2 peaks that we see. One is around the puberty time, but again, we are starting to see another peak around menopausal time. But again, I think that's the time when there are lots of concerns around body shape and image. Social pressure and bullying is a huge one. It's a huge one at the minute. And especially in the secondary school, there is so much emphasis on wanting to be perfect, looking perfect. If you go on any kind of social media, it's always about healthy eating, wanting a perfect, specific size and shape. And that can put a lot of pressure on young people. Emotional distress, other psychiatric illnesses, obviously, if you have them, then you're more prone and more likely to develop eating disorder. And then, of course, then hits the COVID pandemic. I mean, I think last year, it was just, I think none of us were prepared for the COVID. And what ended up happening was people had to spend more time indoors. They were just spending a lot of the time on internet. They didn't have a lot of social activities to get on to. They were just very, very isolated. I remember the times because, all the family members are in the house, they are getting on nerves with each other. There is very limited control over the situation. There is a lot of uncertainty. And then when we talk about that emotional eating, but at the same time, this huge message from the social media about weight loss, healthy eating, couch to 5K, which is obviously with the good intentions, there is no doubt about it. But for our vulnerable young people, it meant that there was tremendous pressure around losing weight and getting into they became very, very vulnerable to develop eating disorders. So, shall we move on to the next slide, please? What we have seen in the pandemic is that the number of urgent referrals have significantly gone up. So we've had about at least 66% increase in the referrals. Health survey in 2019 showed that 16% of adults aged 16 or over were screened positive for eating disorders in the UK, which is 266% increase since 2007. And I was just talking to Pallab before the session. Actually, in the last 2 years, we have seen tremendous increase. So I would easily say that these numbers are going to be even higher if we look at the current picture in the society. It is the third most common chronic illness in adolescents after asthma, obesity, but actually it is the costliest. So, the estimated cost in the UK is 15 billion pounds per annum. We've had 4-fold increase in the demand for hospital admissions in the last 10 years. And there's huge pressure. We are having to send people to Edinburgh and all sorts of places. Yeah, next slide, please. So there are lots of myths about eating disorders. They haven't lost so much weight before they can have, there used to be some numbers, you've got to be a certain weight before you can be referred. That's a myth. I think anybody who is losing weight rapidly needs to get help as soon as possible. You look great. I mean, comments like that, you look great, you've lost so much of weight, everybody would be envious of you. I think in some ways it does give a very wrong message to the adolescents. Yeah, so again, I won't go into all that details now. Shall we move on to the next slide, please? So I think I would like to focus on this slide because I think because the eating disorders can be very sneaky, what are the things that should concern the professionals and family members? So it's a questionnaire, simple screening questionnaire called as SCOFF. S stands for sick. Do they make themselves sick because they are uncomfortably full? C for control. Do they worry that they have lost control over how much they eat? O is for 1 stone. So have they lost about more than 6 kilograms in 3 months? Do they believe that they are fat when others are saying they're thin? Would they say that food dominates their life? Yeah. So next page, please. Again, I think these are some of the physical signs that people need to be mindful about, recognizing them, and early interventions. If you're noticing these, that means your body is not getting enough nutrition and you've got to make sure that you're having regular meals. Next slide, please. So as I said, they are very sneaky. Again, I'm not sure if we have enough time to go over them. But I think if young people I think I will just highlight some of them. Worry about eating in front of others, worry about eating a very safe range of food, struggling to eat fast food, struggling to eat outside, social eating. I don't know if people have heard about mukbang. So basically what mukbang is about, watching people online and they're just eating, and then it's associated with the slurping sounds and everything. And Again, I think that preoccupation with the eating, because what would happen is if they've restricted for a certain amount of time, the brain would be craving for glucose. And then what people try and do is they watch all the food related programs, or they would engage in lots of cooking. They would cook for others or bake for others, but they wouldn't eat anything. So they're trying to get those needs met just by doing the food related things without really fueling the activity. So yeah, so these are some of the things that adults and professionals need to be aware about. Shall we move on to the next slide, please? I think I've covered some of them. And again, exercise is an important one, exercising uncontrollably, not being fueling the activities. That's an important one to remember. Shall we move on to the next slide, please? And I think I was looking at the question somebody has posted, Nikki has posted, children are having problems with obesity and eating disorder. What can we do to improve their relationship with food? I think it's about family time. Like Tracy was saying, stick to the regular meal times. Do have those open conversations with them. Try and bust their myths. Try and stress the importance of regularized eating and how that is going to be helpful in the long term to maintain the weight. It's not about weight gain or anything. And I think some of the things that Tracy has said as well are important, isn't it? Mindful eating. Everyone as a family, we have the rule again, as part of our treatment, we would definitely recommend family meals without social media, trying to have a good time and being able to enjoy the foods. Important to fuel the activities, avoid obsessive exercise. I always say you need to have one rest day a week. You can't be doing activities every single day of the week. So, you know, everyone just needs to be a bit more kind to their body. Yeah. And rest days and cheat days are important. And again, I think, yeah, one needs to know what kind of reasonable weight they need to be, but avoid over focusing, avoid excessing weighing. We always say, I think, especially with the eating disorder, we just tell the families get rid of the weighing scales. I'm aware that the other side is becoming more prevalent, and obesity and everything as well, isn't it? Shall we move on to the next slide? Because I think that covers it, isn't it? So don't weigh yourself frequently. Certainly not more than once a week. Don't spend lots and lots of time checking your body or looking at yourself in the mirror. Don't cut yourself off from family and friends. Avoid websites. I think, again, if you've got any teenagers at home, definitely monitor their social media and you know, kind of things that they're accessing on the social media. People having apps on their phones about the step count and the calorie counting apps, really, I think, especially for the adolescents, they're not helpful in the long term. In terms of the interventions, early help is the key. I think if you're noticing any of the sneaky signs, try and get the help as soon as possible. There's a website called as BEAT, B-E-A-T, and it's an online resource. They have lots of information about eating disorders and lots of helpful resources as well. Then there are, again, I'm not very familiar with the organizations outside NHS, but in Nottingham, we have First Steps, and I think there is something called as Freed Beaches. So those are some of the organizations outside NHS who would offer support to low-level eating disorders. With NHS, yeah, eating disorder teams, again, yeah, we take referrals from the GPs and hospital treatments. I think, yeah, that's it. So summarize, I think we've got to get the balance right, because I think, again, that's one vulnerability that we have seen in the referrals is, yes, at home, moms and dads are dieting, but I think it's that key message sharing with the young people that actually, yes, we need to do it because of our age and the metabolic changes associated with it, whereas young people definitely need to fuel their activities. Yeah. Okay, sorry, we've gone over. I think that's it. Pallab, did you want to have any summary points?
Yeah, I don't know whether people can hear me now. I thought Nikki's question was the $1 million question, isn't it? When we have this public health series of seminars talking about the importance of losing weight and the problem of obesity and childhood obesity. And on the other hand, we are talking about sort of like the danger of losing weight as well, and how costly and risky it can be, especially for young people. How do we improve the relationship between food and the population is $1 million question. I think you have answered. I think you have covered it, Meghna, mostly by saying this is the trick is in the balance and awareness, and being aware and being vigilant for the individual who are in the role of sort of the professionals or the carers, the teachers who are proximal to the individual, for them to be mindful of that possibility, and it's never one size fits all. It's quite individualized. So when we pass on public health message through our services, through our professionals, through our teachers and parents, we'll have to be mindful of that caveat that it is contextual and it's personalized, and the same message can be interpreted differently by different people depending on their lens through which they're looking at them and how they see themselves, and other social and contextual factors. So it's about raising awareness of the other side as well as the problem of obesity, and I think it's about striking the right balance, and everybody, all of us, being aware of that balance. And the importance.
And I think somebody has just posted the question there, isn't it? What public health interventions are there versus individual interventions? And unfortunately, not many. I think there is a lot of emphasis in the public health around obesity, not enough on the other side. As far as I know, the faculty of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the eating disorder faculty is linking up with the public health. But I agree, I think there's a lot more potential to do more work around that ground level work and educating schools and raising awareness of the eating disorders as well.
Completely agree with that point. Yes, I think this was the idea of us bringing some balance to the.
Yeah, we thought we would bring in some. Yeah.
To talk about that possibility, and so that so the solution to that is all of you basically taking the message to everyone's respective sort of services and roles to raise awareness about that balance needs to be struck, and in our own roles for the schools and for the families to be aware of that. That's probably the beginning of public health intervention.
Thank you so much, Meghna and Pallab. Really interesting presentation. And thank you so much, Tracy and Wendy. I think the whole session was really good, all of it, emotional eating and eating disorder. I've got a lot of things to take home from this presentation, and I think so is everyone. It's just because of the time. I think the time was short for this both excellent talks, but we have covered as much as we could do. So thank you, everyone. Is Tracy and Wendy, do you want to go back to any of your questions? I don't mind if because this is everyone's every chance actually to speak to you directly. So.
No, I think we've covered most of the questions that were in the chat earlier. If people have Wendy's, we can share our emails if people have follow-up questions. Fantastic. In the interest of time.
Fantastic, thank you.
But just to thank you for the opportunity, really, on behalf of Wendy and myself.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, I'll close the session now, and I'll be sending the feedback forms to everyone. Please spare a few minutes to fill the feedback forms. Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Bye. I'll close the session now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for that.
Bye.
Bye.